السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. All praise belongs to God, the one and only. Peace and blessing of God be upon his final messengers. Today's Friday reminder is about advice during lockdown. Advice for religious, spiritual, neighbourly and social life during lockdown. Because we're based here in the United Kingdom and we this week have entered a national lockdown which may last 2 to 3 months, just as last year, and some of you watching from around the world will be in a similar situation. This reminder will be in 3 main parts. The first will be the personal, religious and spiritual advice. Second part would be neighbourly and social advice, but that is of course all part of religion and spirituality. And the third part will be an extension of that, our civic duties during lockdown. Again, these cannot be separated from religion and spirituality, our civic duty and etiquette or adab. So firstly, personal and spiritual. There is a lovely verse of the Quran which recounts God's advice to Moses and Aaron, Musa and Harun, the prophets and brothers. Moses and Aaron, Musa and Harun, alayhim salam, peace be upon them. When they were leading the Israelites, the Bani Israel, the children of Israel, in Egypt during intense persecution and oppression. And that verse is in Surah Yunus, the chapter devoted to, or named after Jonah. And the ayah goes as follows. وأوحينا إلى موسى وأخيه أن تبوأ لقومكما بمصر بيوتا واجعلوا بيوتكم قبلة وأقيموا الصلاة وبشر المؤمنين. The meaning of which is we inspired to Moses and his brother to settle for yourselves houses and for your people in Egypt. Establish homes for yourselves in Egypt and make your homes into places of worship and give good news, glad tidings to the believers. And this is very important advice for certain situations, like people facing persecution, because of course the Israelites in Egypt, Bani Israel, were basically slaves and they were discriminated against by the ruling Egyptians headed by the Pharaoh. Musa alayhi salam, through Allah's amazing decree, had been brought up in the royal palace with the Pharaoh like a son, but later of course he was informed that he was a prophet of God who was sent to lead the Israelites out of slavery, the Bani Israel. And of course the Israelites, the Bani Israel, were persecuted enormously by Pharaoh, including the killing of their babies, the mass killing of random people, and all kinds of other persecution, which is a long story in itself. And by the way, there are a couple of movies, because during this time people watch a lot of movies. There are a couple of movies which depict this well. One is Moses the Lawgiver, the classic from the 70s perhaps. But more recent one is called Exodus. And it tells the story only of the Exodus part of the story of the Israelites in Egypt, precisely this phase. And it's well worth watching because it really depicts how awful that persecution was. Now, during this persecution, this verse of Surah Yunus reminds us that Moses and Aaron were told to lead their people to establish their homes as places of worship. Literally make their houses a qibla. But here it means places of worship and to establish the prayer, and give good tidings to the believers. So that is the first piece of advice, obviously, is to don't forget prayer and worship, which is our link with God, because I will come on to family, social, and neighbourly and civic duties later. But we always need to strengthen our inner self, personal spiritual strength, in order to more effectively carry out all those other duties, quite apart from that importance of the direct link with God as well. So an example of that is what we are doing right now, is to pray together as a family. All right, because the mosques are closed, or certainly closed for collective worship, and other places of worship as well. And one of the many blessings in disguise of the COVID pandemic has been giving time to families to spend more time with each other and connect and to be tested, because it is a big test. Sadly, sometimes people fight and get on each other's nerves and get sick and tired of each other when they're in lockdown together and cooped up. But equally, it is an opportunity to do more things together as a family. So, for example, eating together, which has a lot of blessings, which is recommended in the Sunnah and the word of the Prophet ﷺ, but especially worshipping together. Now, whenever possible, to say the 5 daily prayers together, it is always better than praying individually. And even Friday prayers, according to one's view on this, because this is a matter of jurisprudence, fiqh, and there are different schools of thought on this one. So there are many jurists who say, well, you need a large gathering for Friday prayers, with a minimum of 12 or 40. 40 is a very common one. The other views are 10 or 12. I should take the view of the Hanbali that the minimum required is 2 or 3, actually, and that is enough. So if you were to follow that view, then you can do Friday prayers with just 2 or 3 people. That's the bare minimum. But if not, then at least spend the time on Friday mornings. Friday mornings, many Muslims have forgotten, is a time of Sabbath, even though the Friday prayers, which is obligatory only for men traditionally, for just half an hour, Friday lunchtime, half an hour to an hour. But in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, Friday morning is a time for worship, prayer, reminder, dhikr, charity, etc. It is like a soft Sabbath, if you like, for the Muslims, just as our Jewish brothers and sisters and cousins have a 24, 25-hour Sabbath on Saturdays. Our Christian friends and neighbors, brothers and sisters, have Sunday morning, basically. And the traditional practice was to rest all day Sunday. Sunday was the rest day, so again, the whole day. Whereas for Muslims, the bare minimum is only half an hour or an hour during about lunchtime or early afternoon. The practice of the Prophet ﷺ was actually to spend the whole of Friday morning between the dawn prayer and noon in private worship. And now, of course, if you're at work or at school, etc., then there's no problem. That comes first. That's your obligation. So you don't have to worry about this practice. But for those of us who have spare time, or are working from home, or have flexible hours, should I say, flexible working times, I highly recommend this Friday morning, this kind of soft Sabbath, to recharge, to reflect, and to reduce some of the stresses of life, actually, and to recharge our spiritual batteries for the rest of the week. This has also reminded us, actually, that of a teaching of the traditional scholars who would say, Al-Baytu Sawmi'atul Mu'min. They'd say a person's house is their monastery or their nunnery or convent. Because, going out of the house was seen as something you do out of necessity for work, or for shopping, or obviously go to the mosque, etc., or important work. But if you had no important reason to be out of the house, it was recommended actually to stay at home and to reflect, because you were less likely to come across harm from outside, or temptation, or get into an argument or fight or whatever. Although there's all kinds of temptations and harms which are streamed into our houses now, of course, because of technology, with television and the internet. So that aspect of making your house a bit of a monastery or convent has been reduced by the modern world, but the principle is still there. And it is interesting, actually, that the whole world is following the advice given to the Prophet's wives in the Quran, which is وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ, stay in your homes, right? And on the basis of that verse, which is directed at the Prophet's wives initially, it's in the feminine plural. The traditional practice of Muslim women and father women all around the world was to have their role based around the home, to have a domestic-based role. That is the traditional way that most societies have functioned for centuries, where men would generally be the breadwinners and women would look after their homes. That has, of course, changed in the modern world. In the last century or so, that has completely changed. And under gender equality, there are also ideas of gender symmetry, and women are completely equal to men in all spheres of life, and are out there in the workplace and in every area of public and private life. And that is generally a good thing. It is something to be welcomed and to be promoted, as long as it respects people's freedoms. And actually, President Obama, of all people, said in his address to the Muslim world in 2009 from the American University of Cairo in Egypt, one of the things he said in that amazing speech, which was about reopening dialogue between the United States and the Muslim world. He said traditional practices are fine, traditional roles for men and women are fine, as long as nobody's being forced into that. If people choose traditional roles, that is absolutely fine, men, women, etc. But if they choose not to, and they want to have non-traditional roles, like men becoming homemakers or house husbands, and women being the breadwinners and going out to work, that's also fine, because the principle of freedom, hurriya, is not only a fundamental principle of the modern West, the United States and France and Europe and the Western countries generally, it is actually a fundamental principle of Islam as well, la ikraha fi din, and to be free. Freedom, liberty is a fundamental Islamic value as well. But anyway, the point is that the irony of that verse, وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ, stay in your homes, has applied to the whole world for almost a year now. And there are many lessons to be learned from staying at home, which is where the heart is. The home represents the heart. And to really focus on what is most important and inner, and what is immediate and close to ourselves. This also reminds me of a great statement by Sayyid Hussein Nasr. I've quoted before, one of the greatest living Muslim thinkers and teachers. He wrote in one of his books that Islam is like a society of married monks and nuns. Islam is like a society of married monks and nuns. What's he saying there? He's saying that basically in Islam, and actually this is true of other religions as well, true of all the other major world religions. I expect my colleagues in other faiths would agree, but I can't speak for them, of course. That's for them to explain. But the idea that every Muslim man, woman, etc., is devoted to worship, devoted to God, and devoted to serving other people. In that sense, they're like a monk or a nun. Daily prayers, minimum 5 if possible. Lots of charity, minimum 2.5% of the excess earning, but more if possible, 5, 10, 20%. Fasting, minimum 1 month during the year, but more if possible. 3 days a month if possible, twice a week if possible, every other day if possible. All of these things, pilgrimage, Umrah and Hajj, minimum once in a lifetime. But more than that, if possible. These are, and then serving the community, feeding the poor, helping neighbours, helping those oppressed or the underprivileged, etc., etc. All of this is spiritual work, which religious and spiritual work, social, civic work, which is monastic. It's what monks and nuns are supposed to do. But in Islam, we don't have monasticism. There's room for it for those who want to. Celibacy, I should say. But people are generally encouraged. We don't have celibate people, we don't have celibate priests, etc. People are encouraged to get married and have family and actually be in the world, enjoy the pleasures of the world whilst being grateful to God. But also to be in the world but not of it, and that's what he means. Allah, when he says married monks and nuns. So, as I said, we don't have monasticism or celibacy as such, actually. There is room for it. Monasticism is mentioned in the Quran. If you do it in the right way, it can be something good. And you have monastic orders within Islam, actually. But most of Muslim society has always been what a Nasr says, married monks and nuns. And the staying at home part is a reminder of the monastic aspect, being like a monk or a nun, devoted as much as possible to prayer, charity, and other good works, while also fulfilling one's other responsibilities. Now, with the prayer, so I would recommend that you pray together. If you don't follow the view of 2 or 3 being enough for Friday prayers, then of course, you'll have to do something else. You'll have to miss Friday prayers or just do Dhuhr prayer as well, of course. But I would still recommend that Friday mornings you could have a talk like I'm giving now instead of a khutbah, which is part of the prayers. You just have a talk or a discussion. So especially in a family, mum, dad, children as well. Somebody gives a short talk, maybe a reading from a book or something they've been reading about. And it doesn't always have to be related to religion, of course, directly, because ultimately everything is related to God. But somebody gives a short reflection on a topic and you have a discussion and you learn together, or you can have classes and things as well. And here I'll mention it because to many people this is controversial, but it should not be. Muslims used to lead the world in open dialogue and thinking, and there should not be taboo subjects, especially when they're in the sacred text. So here I'll mention there's a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawud which mentions a female, a woman, a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, leading prayers in her own home, leading men in prayer. Her name was Waraqa. And it says the hadith says that the Prophet gave her permission because she was the most learned and she was well versed in the Quran, etc., that she would lead her household in prayer, including the men. The hadith mentions she had an old man in her household who was the mu'adhin who gave the adhan. Now, like with many hadiths, that hadith established the principle that women can lead prayers, even they can lead men if the hadith is authentic. Now, of course, like many hadiths, the authenticity of that hadith is disputed. However, great scholars like Ibn Hajar accepts its authenticity because he mentioned that story of Waraqa in his Taqrib al-Tahdhib, his book of the narrators of hadith. Imam Suyuti mentioned this hadith as a true story in his Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, his great work on the sciences of the Quran. Our Sheikh al-Albani confirmed that the hadith was sahih and sound. Now, once it is sound, what does it establish? Well, at the minimum, it establishes that in such a position, a woman can lead her household in prayer, including men, including her son, especially if she's well versed and learned. And of course, the big argument or debate in the modern world is, can it be extended outside her home to her neighborhood, to her community? Can women be imams of mosques and that kind of thing, or of women-only mosques, for example? There are women-only mosques in the UK now, in Europe and around the world, but I'm not going to go into that discussion, actually. That's a big topic. What I am going to say is that hadith is confirmed as being sound by many, many top hadith scholars, and it would certainly apply in this time where we need people to come together and learn the religion and pray and worship together. So that's some advice on the personal and spiritual. Remember your prayers as much as possible, including with family and including under oppression. I mean, alhamdulillah, most of us are not under oppression, but there are people in that situation. We think especially the Uyghur Muslims in China, living under horrific repression, where they're not allowed to establish, where the Chinese government sadly is trying to erase their identity as Muslims with this forced indoctrination, so-called re-education camps, with the destruction of hundreds of mosques, with banning them from observing fasting during Ramadan, with forcing them to adopt another language, which is not their own native Turkestani language, which is written in the Arabic script and has strong links with their Islamic roots, and to force them to adopt the Chinese language, etc., etc. This is horrific repression going on, and probably amounts to genocide. And it is very important for people to speak up. Alhamdulillah, many people from all backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, atheists, humanists, many, many people, Buddhists, Sikhs, there are many people speaking up against this horrific repression. Please do join them. Join in the campaigning, the lobbying, the peaceful protest to support our brothers and sisters, the Uyghur Muslims in China, in Xinjiang or East Turkestan. It is one of the biggest issues of our age right now, an attempted genocide going on now. But this advice would apply to them. Make your hands a place of prayer, and have patience with Bashir al-Mu'mineen, and give good tidings, good news to the believers. So after that personal and spiritual reflections, or the personal reflection, let's move on to the social and neighbourly, which is also or spiritual. Now, just to remind ourselves, again in the Quran, we are told to be kind to our neighbours. وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ الْجُنُبِ وَالصَّاحِبِ بِالْجَنبِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ مَنْ كَانَ مُخْتَالًا فَخُورًا. I mean, that one verse summarizes the whole religion again. Just Imam Shafi said about Surah Al-Asr, 3 short verses can summarize the whole religion. It's enough. This is another example. The Quran is full of many examples of this, where one verse is enough to summarize the whole religion. We don't have to make it too complicated. And this verse of Surah An-Nisa, which says, worship God. Do not associate any partners with God. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and be kind to your parents. You start with the parents. Honor your parents is one of the top commandments after worshipping God. It's the second commandment, in fact, in Islam. And then after that, not only kindness to parents, but kindness to others. With al-qurba wal-yatama wal-masakin, to your relatives, starting with the nearest relatives, and then beyond, and to orphans, and to the poor, and needy and indigent, the poor and needy. وَابْنِ to travelers. Before that, وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ الْجُنُبِ, and to your neighbors, your near neighbors, and your far neighbors. So again, you start with your nearest neighbors, your next door neighbors have the most right of you, and then the neighbors beyond that. And then those who live closest to you, and travelers, people are stranded, when people are traveling, they are strangers, they're unfamiliar with the local place, so they need extra help. People should always be hospitable towards strangers and travelers, who will often need help because they don't know the local language or the local facilities or way to go, etc. وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, that verse also mentions kindness to slaves, because at that time there was slavery. And of course, alhamdulillah, the Islamic world, like most of the world, has abolished slavery. However, there is modern slavery in the world, but it's not condoned, so we don't talk about being kind to modern slaves, we should be trying to free and stop modern slavery. But again, that's another topic for another time. Here we're talking about neighbours. Be kind to your neighbours. It goes beyond that. In the hadith it says, honour your neighbours. If you believe in God in the last day, in God in the hereafter, you must honour your neighbour. The way you honour your parents, the way you honour your children, the way you honour your brother and sister, your family, honour your neighbour, who will at first be a complete stranger to you. When they first move in or you first move in, you don't know them. You may have no links whatsoever with them, but the fact that they live next to you means it's become a close link. That is a teaching of God through the angel Jibreel to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, through Gabriel, and then from the Prophet ﷺ to his companions. Honor your neighbor. Their right is very, very important. Or at the bare minimum, as I said in another hadith, من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فلا يؤذي جاره. Please don't harm them. If you believe in God in the last day, please don't harm your neighbor. If you can't be good to them or kind to them or honor them, at least don't harm them. Sadly, some people harm their neighbors. And a neighbor from hell, as we say in English, a neighbor from hell is one of the worst things you can have, because you have to live with that all your life. A bit like having a boss or an employee or a colleague from hell at work, or at school, a bully in your classroom, for example, because you can't get away from them, basically. And, sadly, every year people have disputes and horrific financial, social disputes with neighbors. But it's one of the blessings of God to have good neighbors and to be good to your neighbors. Now, in the time of lockdown in COVID, we know that many of our neighbors are finding it very difficult. It's a very difficult time for people everywhere. Many people have lost their jobs, they've lost income. People are struggling to feed themselves and their families. In Britain here, in supposedly one of the most developed and richest countries on earth, there are millions of accesses to food banks now. Every week people don't have enough food to feed themselves or their families. It's the reality, which we must not ignore, which is why today's Friday collection is for the Trussell Trust, which run the food banks, or is one of the largest national organizations running food banks all around the country. So please do try to donate. The donate button, I think, only takes a minimum of £4 or £5 of dollars donation, which is a bit of a shame. We should take one so that people chip in whatever they can. But if you can, please do chip in and make a donation, as well as listening, inshallah. Now, so many neighbors are struggling. Many neighbors are shielding. We know that. Elderly neighbors who cannot go out of the house. I spoke to an elderly neighbor this week who since last March has only been out of the house 3 times in 10 months. Only 3 times out of the house. And may God bless them. Many of her neighbors are actually cooking hot food for her every day. Otherwise she would not get a warm meal at all. Every day they deliver a hot meal to her once a day, and they do a shopping for her and get her medicines and all this kind of thing. In fact, I know 2 on that same road, at least 2 neighbors who are shielding, who cannot go out of the house. Now, looking after the neighbors, honor your neighbor. So one of the many other blessings in disguise of the COVID pandemic is how not just family, but neighborhoods have pulled together. People helping out, doing the shopping for the neighbors, cooking hot food for them, delivering food. All of these things, these simple things, are the most important, actually, when it comes to religion and being a good person. So, for example, in the Quran we have وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَىٰ طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ وَلَا تَحُضُّونَ عَلَىٰ طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. The Quran talks about that you don't encourage each other to feed the poor, or that there are people who do not encourage feeding the poor. I mean, how can you ignore people who are hungry? How can we ignore them while we are eating to our fill? There's a famous hadith, of course, of the Prophet, peace be upon him, ﷺ, where he said, you're not a believer, or that person not a believer, he said, who goes to bed full while their neighbor is hungry. So it doesn't matter whether we have a Muslim name, or how many books we've read, or how much knowledge we have, or what we do in life, what we've done in life, is if there are people struggling in our neighborhood, And we know about that and we're not doing anything about it. The Prophet said to us, you're not a believer, you don't have faith. Where is your faith? In another lovely hadith, and I keep talking about this, where the principle of religion are simple. In one hadith, the Prophet was asked, and again a sound hadith, which aspect of Islam is best? Ayyul Islami khair? Yeah, which aspect of Islam is best? What's the best thing we can do? Actually, he gave different answers to the same question, according to different questioners, knowing their background and what they needed. But in this one, he said, to answer that question, which aspect of Islam is best? Yeah? He replied, أن تطعم الطعام وتقرأ السلام على من عرفت ومن لم تعرف. He said it is to feed people. And secondly, to greet people, whether you know them or not. Simple, that's it. Feed people. And secondly, greet people, whether you know them or not. Say Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, or just greet them generally. A positive greeting is a compliment and lift somebody's mood. One of the problems in modern cities is people don't talk to each other, they don't greet each other. Well, they should. Assalamu alaikum, good morning, how are you? Just to lift each other's spirits, especially in this time. So feed people. By the way, that includes feeding poor people. It also includes feeding families and, being a host at parties, like weddings, or a people's baby celebration, all that kind of thing. Just feeding people generally, but especially nowadays feeding people who don't have access to food. Because you have to remember, people are grieving, they're traumatized, many people have lost relatives to COVID, or they're in fear and grief, worried about catching COVID and catching the coronavirus. People are traumatized by the loss of the usual life, loss of work, loss of income, the loss of daily work. People are shielding. The mental health issues are obviously have increased. There's no surprise, because this is a traumatic and stressful time for everybody. Loneliness has increased, especially if people are not able to go out of the house. Domestic violence has increased, sadly, and that is sadly to be expected because people are cooped up together. And this is why the importance of religion. And this is why religion is really important. And I say to our atheist and humanist friends who can be very critical of religion, is that religion can be done badly. There's no doubt about that. And many of you will criticize religion for a lot of the evil that has been done in the name of religion. And I hope most believers will agree with you on that. Yeah, awful horrors have been done in the name of religion throughout the centuries. But don't forget the flip side, that immense goodness has also been done in the name of religion. The greatest saints, the greatest heroes have also been inspired by religion. Many, if not most, of the greatest heroes of humanity have been inspired by a sense of the divine, the sacred, and by their religious teachings and beliefs. So this is where religious and spiritual teaching, religion done well is beautiful. Good religion is good. We need more of that. We need more places of worship, good religion, good religious and spiritual activity. Where it's misused and used for evil, for negative, then we need less of that. An anti-bad religion, but to promote good religion. And so some of this advice, if it's helpful, inshallah, it will help with reducing people's grief, fear, trauma, mental health issues, psychospiritual issues, loneliness, domestic violence, all these kind of things, but people will be able to, inshallah, God willing, control and learn from this test that we're in, because life is a test. There's a particular test going on with the pandemic and with national lockdowns all over the world. So that's the basic advice. Get involved. If God has blessed you, if you're in need of food, for example, in need of help, reach out, ask. Neighbors will be very willing to help. But if God has blessed you with enough food and an income, etc., please get involved with the neighborly groups. And it's irrespective of religion. The Prophet didn't say honor your neighbor only if they're Muslim or only if they're the same religion as you. He said honor your neighbor, no matter who they are. There's famous hadith about the Prophet asking about his Jewish neighbors, etc., etc. We should not need to repeat that, actually. And it is wonderful that there are churches, mosques, temples, places of worship, synagogues of all types, running food banks running soup kitchens, running baby banks with baby clothes and nappies and things, because having a baby is so expensive, to help newborn and expecting mothers with those essentials, because it's difficult enough having a baby, but especially in the pandemic. Please get involved with those. With your local mosque, church, temple, whatever it is. If your local mosque does not have a food bank, please encourage them to start one. In my local area, almost every church I know is running a food bank or a soup kitchen. I do not know of a single church locally, and I'm thinking about half a dozen to a dozen that I know of. Every single one is running a food bank or a soup kitchen or a community fridge or something like that. One of them running a baby bank as well. Of the mosques in the area, about 20 to 25% are running a food bank. That's what I know of. I mean, I hope the number's higher, because I hope there's food banks that I don't know about. But I certainly know at least one or two masajid who have tens of thousands of pounds in their bank balances and who have not run a food bank yet. I mean, they have sadaqah, even sadaqah al-fitr, zakat al-fitr money lying around to feed the poor. And based on the misconception they can only feed Muslims. Well, there's lots of Muslim families. I know Muslim families who need food who the churches are feeding. And if you look, Ibn Rushd showed this in Bidayat al-Mujtahid. The Hanafi and other schools allowed zakat al-fitr to go to non-Muslims, to Ahlul Kitab especially, but for now it would be to everybody, to every citizen. There is this common idea that zakat al-fitr at the end of Ramadan only goes to Muslims, because there is traditional fiqh around that. But that's not the only view. The Hanafi said it can go to non-Muslims. And in my mind, the fatwa is really quite clear. I mean, I wrote a fatwa on this myself, that we live in modern citizenship-based societies, not societies divided along religious lines, that some people would wish to continue. And therefore, zakat al-fitr should go to anybody who needs that food. So we have masajid actually sitting on thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of pounds of zakat al-fitr who have not distributed a penny. And there are hundreds of families in their neighborhoods struggling for food. So please, we must correct this, encourage your masajid, volunteer, set up a food bank. There are organizations like the Trussell Trust and others who can help you, give you all the support you need to set up a food bank and do this great work, which is as much worship, perhaps more important worship than prayer, etc. Although I say prayer is important because it keeps us centered and strengthens us to do all of this other important work. As I said, the Prophet said, it's one of the best aspects of Islam, feed people. And the Quran condemns those who don't encourage the feeding of the poor and feeding other people. So that's social and neighbourly. Knock on doors. And by the way, by the grace of God, I try to do all of this before I preach about it. It's one of the principles. This is a reminder to brothers and sisters who are imams and teachers and preachers. Is before you ever teach or preach something, try to do it yourself first. You must try to do that yourself first. Sayyidina Umar, when he was Khalifa, Umar bin al-Khattab, whenever he wanted to promote something or forbid it, he would gather his family beforehand, his household first, and say, I am now going to publicly promote something to do a certain type of good, or I'm going to forbid something. So you must all do this with me. And if I forbid something, let me not find any person in my household, my family, violating that rule. Otherwise, there will be consequences. That was his view, because he understood. You have to lead by example. And we ask Allah, we ask God to guide our leaders, the political leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, to learn from this noble example of Caliph Umar bin al-Khattab, who understood that you lead by example, and so you don't have ministers breaking COVID rules, for example, or any other leaders doing that. And Hassan al-Basri said, before you preach to others, he said, preach to yourself first, or admonish yourself first. عِذْ نَفْسَكَ. He said, ثُمَّ عِذْ نَفْسَكَ. عِذْ نَفْسَكَ 99 مرة أو 100 مرة قبل أن تعظ الآخرين. Hassan al-Basri said, it's a reminder for people like myself, a reminder to myself first and others who have the responsibility of standing up and teaching or preaching. Hassan al-Basri said, admonish yourself first, then admonish yourself again. Then he said, admonish yourself 99 or 100 times before you dare admonish anybody else. So all of these things, we're trying to do, And when we encourage others, please try to do them first yourself before encouraging others. Knock on doors, talk to your neighbours. Please talk to them from the outside. Of course, you can't go in under lockdown, but wear your mask and just ask how they're doing. Many of them are lonely, and we all appreciate contact from friends, etc. Finally, I'll move to the last part of this khutbah. Will be actually in the second part of it. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. I seek the forgiveness of God. Please ask for His forgiveness also. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. We've been talking about spiritual, religious, social, neighbourly advice during the lockdown and during the COVID pandemic. The second part of this reminder is about our civic duty, and that by that I mean as citizens or people who live in a neighbourhood or in a city or a town or a village or in a particular country. And the most important aspect there is to follow the law of the land, especially the rules around COVID right now. Now, this is something which has been controversial for a long time, or many of us Muslims in the West who are living in non-Muslim majority countries have been confused about for a long time. I mean, I was certainly confused about it for years because there weren't clear answers coming even from our scholars, because they were new to the situation as well of living in countries which are majority non-Muslim. But more recently, the ulama have studied and discussed about these deeply and have come up with a very clear answer, is that you must follow the law of the land. And the only exceptions are that when it openly orders you to do something which is immoral or haram or completely prohibited. Example of that would be the oppression of the Uyghur Muslims by the Chinese government, which I mentioned before. But the basis for this, people will ask, well, where does it say in the Quran you follow the law of the land? The answer is all of the verses which say fulfill your promises, especially, for example, the first ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud. O believers, fulfill your covenants or promises. Keep your promises, basically. Now, in the modern world, whichever land we live in, we will have citizenship or a passport or a visa or permission to stay, residency, etc. And all of that comes with obligations. So we have rights. We have all kinds of rights: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of travel, of movement, all kinds of things. In return, we also have obligations to pay our taxes, for example, but also not to break the law, not to be a criminal. So that is the basis, which I would like people to remember. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud, and many other verses, wa awfu bil ahd, for example. Wa inna Allaha ya'murukum an tu'addu al-amanati ila ahliha. All the verses which say keep your promises, they include following the law of the land, especially when it comes to these COVID rules, because they are especially not for individuals only, but they only work if everybody follows them collectively. And there's a great lesson in this for other people. And this is where Muslims have to remember, as Sheikh Hamza once said, that Muslims have a tradition. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf said 5 years ago here in London, he said, Muslims have a tradition of honouring government. It is very easy, I mentioned this before, it's very easy to sit and criticise rulers. Much more difficult to actually do a better job oneself. Now, where rulers or governments are openly doing oppressive and immoral things, I mentioned the possible genocide against the Uyghurs and others, Rohingya and others, that must be called out. But when it's something difficult, I mean, we've experienced it. Many of us are not able to run a family of a few people, or run a mosque of a few hundred or thousands of people, or a church or a temple, without disagreement and without problems. And somehow we think that we could easily run a city like London of 8-10 million people, or a country like Britain of 70 million people, or a country like Pakistan of over 200 million people, or Bangladesh, or India and China of more than 1 billion people. It's not that easy at all. And here we have to have the discipline which the military has. The armed forces in every country, they're entitled to their own political views, but their discipline is that they get behind the government and they do whatever they have to do in the national interest, because they're protecting the nation and they're helping out, like the military is now helping out with the COVID vaccines here in Britain. Of course, in a democracy, we have the right to disagree. I'm not saying don't disagree. In a democracy like Britain, we all have the democratic right to disagree and to be activists, to join opposition political parties, do lobbying and campaigning, all the rest of it. What I'm saying is to avoid immature, petty, tribal party politics just to criticize the government for the sake of it, just because you don't like them or their party or them as individuals. Because when your party gets into power, then you'll face the same thing, actually. Then you'll see how unfair it is when people just easily sit and criticize without giving constructive alternatives. But that's a side political point, which I don't want to get into too much. It's not a political point, it's about the etiquette of disagreement. But the basic point here is to follow the rules, because by breaking the rules, by having illegal parties, or some masajid, would you believe, having illegal gatherings over the Christmas New Year period, to have unauthorized gatherings at a time when the local hospitals are full of COVID patients and struggling under the strain. It is utterly irresponsible, immoral, illegal, and haram completely to break the rules in this way, and to have illegal parties or gathering in people's homes, or God forbid, even worse, in places of worship, which has happened sadly over the last year. So that includes, wear the mask. I mean, there's a mask. We've all seen this. Wearing of a mask becomes a religious duty, because it is protecting our health and the health of other people, and it is part of awfu bil uqud, follow the rules. And also the etiquette. If you're exempt from wearing a mask, I'm actually exempt from wearing a mask, but in public I wear the mask. It's just out of etiquette, if you can get away with it. If it's bad for your health, really bad for your health, and of course your health comes first, you must follow the mask, etc. But even if you're exempt, it's good etiquette to still follow, so that other people don't feel bad. Well, why is he or she not wearing a mask? What do I have to? And although, of course, good people, good nations, people understand why that person must have an exemption, etc. But it also avoids unnecessary aggro. People might get angry and pick an argument or fight with you, or people in shops or other buildings might think you're flouting the rules on purpose. So that's just etiquette, but it's not compulsory, of course. I'm saying that even if you're exempt to follow the mask, but the vast majority of people are not exempt, so do follow those rules. That was the last part, to follow the national rules, whether we agree with them or not. It is a matter of ijtihad. It's a matter of ijtihad as to what is the best thing to do, what's the best way of controlling the virus and stopping the spread of the disease, etc., etc. These are matters of ijtihad. And rulers, political leaders, have to make a decision, one way or the other. And we are free to disagree with the decisions and to campaign to change those decisions or laws if we believe they're wrong, or they've made the judgment call wrong. But in the meantime, when something becomes law, becomes the official directive, it becomes a religious obligation to actually follow that, while having the democratic right in a democracy or in other political systems to disagree and to try to change it for the better. In uridu illa al-islaha mastata'tu, as the Prophet says in the Quran. It's Prophet Shu'aib, isn't it? In uridu illa al-islaha mastata'tu, I wish to improve things, to reform or to repair things as much as possible. That's all. I'm not trying to impose my will on you. All I'm saying is that these things I believe are wrong in society, and I am speaking up to try to do better. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our individual, personal, family, neighbourly, social and civic lives, to enable us to root all of these in your worship of God, to realize that all of these responsibilities and the tests that have come through us through the COVID pandemic and through the national lockdowns, these are all ultimately good for us in terms of our training. We ask Allah to enable us and to inspire us to do as much as we can to help those less fortunate and to spread goodness and charity and goodwill amongst our family, neighbors, friends, amongst our society, because this is a time where we're all struggling, we're all finding it very difficult, and we need to pull together to help each other out. As Allah says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Cooperate, help each other in kindness and goodness and saintliness. Do not help each other in sin and enmity and transgression. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. وصلى الله تعالى على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون. وأقيموا الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي الصلاة حي الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى سيذكر من يخشى ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصلى النار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. هل أتاك حديث الغاشية وجوه يومئذ خاشعة عاملة ناصبة تصلى نارا حامية تسقى من عين آنية ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع وجوه يومئذ ناعمة لسعيها راضية في جنة عالية لا تسمع فيها لاغية فيها عين جارية فيها سرر مرفوعة وأكواب موضوعة ونمارق مصفوفة وزرابي مبثوثة أفلا ينظرون إلى الإبل كيف خلقت وإلى السماء كيف رفعت وإلى الجبال كيف نصبت وإلى الأرض كيف سطحت فذكر إنما أنت مذكر لست عليهم بمسيطر إلا من تولى وكفر فيعذبه الله العذاب الأكبر إن إلينا إيابهم ثم إن علينا حسابهم. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد. اللهم من شر فتنة المسيح الدجال. اللهم حسبني حسابا يسيرا. حسبني حسابا يسيرا. لا إله إلا أنت. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله استغفر الله استغفر الله. وعلى السلام والسلام. لا إله إلا الله. اللهم لا كل شيء قدير. الله لا من لما أطيت ولا نطيت ومن أعتبر الفاجر من كل الله لا إله إلا هو القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من الذي يشاء إلا بإذنه يعلم بين أيديهم وخلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا ما شاء ولا يدرك وهو العلي العظيم.